Welcome to Innovators Inside, the podcast for people working in corporate innovation, brought to you by Alchemist X, the corporate services division of Alchemist Accelerator. Here, you'll follow host Rachel Chalmers, head of Alchemist X, as she talks to the industry's highest achievers and most compelling thought leaders. These are fly-on-the-wall conversations with leading practitioners in the field. They'll share their lessons learned so that you don't have to go through the painful experiences that they did. So sit back, relax, and get ready to level up.
Today, it's my very great pleasure to welcome my friend Jeanne Morain to the podcast. Jeanne began her career in startups and made her first big splash when BMC Software acquired Marimba. Marimba was the company founded by Kim Palese, the original product manager for the Java programming language. It was a precursor to basically everything we take for granted today: containers, orchestration, device management, patch management. Marimba ended up being sold to Samsung, and it's still in use at Starbucks, powering everything from cars to fridges. Without it, there's no continuous delivery, there's no DevOps. In working to integrate Marimba's software, Jeanne became a pioneer in the development of business service management, BSM, the foundation for what we now call digital transformation. From BMC, Jeanne moved to executive roles with Thinstall, which was acquired by VMware, InstallFree, and Flexera. In the middle of all this, she also wrote the definitive books on desktop virtualization, Client for Cloud, and digital transformation, Visible Ops Private Cloud. She is a highly sought-after advisor to executive boards and CEOs, and is now working on a digital transformation startup of her own. Jeanne, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you here. Can you talk about some of the ways in which business service management and digital transformation lie at the heart of corporate innovation?
Absolutely. When you think about even the first ideation for business service management, it came from the need for the business to have visibility into what is the spend of IT or technology. And even at that time, so BSM was first started in 2002. A lot of people thought it wasn't until later, but it was actually in 2002. And it was needing that visibility and understanding so that from a regulatory, from a compliance, from a looking at the business of the company, not just the business of IT, what is the impact of technology into the bottom line, that overall total cost of ownership. And so when you think about for corporate innovation, why it's so critical and how BSM has really evolved into digital transformation is it's looking at, here we are, flash forward, literally 18 years later, looking at now that we have a generation of users that have never known the world without Facebook, right, Google, search engines, mobile cell phones. They're looking at every business as a software business. Every business needs to have that understanding of what are the true costs, not just business as usual, but of implementing this technology for the life cycle of that service within an organization. And so I'm still seeing today, as part of their digital transformation efforts, companies who started with BSM never quite got to the full vision that are now transforming to that vision so that they can do things like cloud bursting and understanding everything from the asset implications to when they add in this new digital technology or they add in this new service that they can speed up to go faster and have that full visibility with predictive analytics and different aspects to it. So it's definitely a significant component of the journey and really almost impossible to undergo that journey without having that base foundation of knowing what do you have.
Yeah, one of the joys of working in such a youth-oriented industry is, young people with all of their energy and enthusiasm. One of the downsides is we're at continual risk of losing our history, of forgetting that in 2002, companies had an IT department and all of the computers lived in the IT department. And then there was the rest of the company, which was most of the company. And you tell that to kids these days and they just don't believe you. But that's where we came from.
It really is important that we don't forget that institutional knowledge. And the reason why I say that is because I have worked with many companies over the years to deploy these large scale deployments, everything from DevOps, working with a large organization on deploying their CI/CD pipeline, looking at that transformation. And the heart of it is if you forget the fundamentals of how we got to where we're at, then it's harder to understand how do I peel that onion back to the basics, to what is that minimal viable product so I can crawl. And then what do I need to walk and versus run to get from vision to reality? So they focus on the technology. And I've seen this mistake happen more often than not. That's why I wrote my last two books, like around the crossing the cloud chasm and embracing digital transformation, was because too many companies couldn't get past the technology phase and thinking about how do I communicate not only up but out and down. And so, and this is the big gap, that it's still a gap that's driving me absolutely insane after all these years. 70% of these large initiatives are failing.
Yep. Yep.
And they're failing because of the fact of communication.
Yeah.
And not focusing not just on technology, but the people process aspect that was part of business service management. That, guess what? We found out it had to be the hard way, because when we went to implement the CMDB, we realized with the first 40 implementations, it wasn't going to work if you didn't have the cultural and mindset shift, if you didn't have the shift in understanding that the processes needed to be automated with the automation and that needed to be changed for compliance. And in 2002 marked the initial compliance restrictions. And, if you think about it, Sarbanes-Oxley was the first act other than the 1932 Security Exchange Commission Act to really have such a significant impact on organizations as a whole. And now what we've seen since has been absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah, I do think at the heart of these communication challenges is our historical amnesia, because it's too easy to say, oh, what are you doing still using a mainframe? Why are you a hospital that's still using BMC Patrol? When the decisions to deploy those products and that hardware made perfect sense at the time. It's just that we don't remember the historical context in which those decisions were made.
Well, and they don't always know if the juice is worth the squeeze, to your
Right.
point. So more oftentimes people think of technology for technology's sake. Let's fast forward, let's grab onto that shiny new object. But if the older technology is not only fulfilling the bill, but the newer stuff doesn't have the minimal viable components to replace it, it's hard to really dislodge it, from the culture. And that's that people culture piece that is the biggest factor for these large initiatives failing.
So let's talk about Kim Palazzi's company, Marimba. It was such a revolutionary, radical company. We don't talk about it much today, and yet it introduced so many of these ideas and approaches whose implications we are still working through.
Marimba for me has been the epicenter of a lot of being able to be successful in this industry, given, a lot of the changes and lifts and shifts. So the key with that company that was phenomenal working for it is there were no glass ceilings. So a lot of the things that I've heard other people complain about, I was fortunate that I had a leader that was able to kind of clear the way, and everyone with a good idea would come to light. So a lot of people don't realize is business service management almost didn't happen.
Mhm.
So when I first pitched that idea, I was laughed at. And I barely got past the second slide. And Kim was in the room, and she basically, and of course, I was young, got upset, stormed out. And then she came to coach me and then asked me, okay, show me your business case. Show me, exactly, go through where the idea is coming from, where it makes sense. And when I explained it all to her, she's like, okay, we'll fund it and we'll make it happen. So it was one of those things that when we originally came up with the idea, a lot of people thought it was crazy because the analysts weren't talking about it yet, because they didn't see it yet. And it really came from a meeting with one of our customers, Ernst & Young, and with many of the other auditors, because, SOX had just passed, Sarbanes-Oxley had just passed, and they were all like, okay, how are we going to, enforce it? And a lot of the vendors were sitting in the room and were like, oh, that's a good question. No, our systems don't talk together. There is no magic database that you could pull this list from that will tell you, everything that you're looking for from these different areas. And they had brought in ITIL from British Telecom. So that's where Malcolm Fry and team ended up getting involved with the whole process. So it was really an interesting time, and really, at least for when I think about those days in Silicon Valley, we're talking in the 90s, early 2000s, it really kind of lifted and shifted the change. So I was fortunate because I was a customer of Marimba back in 1996, actually started their user group and then was recruited to join them. And a lot of the things that they were doing were so innovative that it was, really kind of the opportunity of a lifetime when you think of the bigger picture. But when I think of everything that they've implemented, the first container products in the market, because containers are what? The C version of Java. So when people are trying to figure out how do I deploy containers in production, well, it's not as scary for someone who's done it for a couple of decades, right? Or looking at everything from subscription-based policy orchestration, adding Active Directory to doing your change and configuration management deployments, some of the first patch management pieces. They were all created, and this is the key, that what I loved about the company, not because we believed that that's what was needed, but because we took a different approach and taking a customer in approach. And instead of listening to all the noise around us, we listened to the people that were actually writing the checks and using the products in production because it was a startup. You had to, or you didn't make it past tomorrow, right? From that perspective. But everyone had a very family type approach and an all in. So there wasn't as much of the negativity that you see happen in a lot of companies or in some startups that frankly kill startups, and that I've seen, some that I've advised, some that I've been part of since, where the infighting because the leaders don't get along. And then it really kind of implodes. And the other key thing that I loved about that startup is they made work fun. So one of my favorite times is Halloween. So all the Marimba founders, so Kim, Sammy, Jonathan, Arthur, many of them played instruments, but they would dress as judges. And we would have closed down on Halloween. We would have contests. So they would have skits and everybody would, you literally decorate their cubes and stuff like that. I was part of the Marimba Martians one year. And we just came up with these like fun skits. And then, once in a while you'd have one of them, Sammy played the drums. You'd have one of them playing the guitar or different things like that. So it was really made it a more fun environment, that you realize you play hard, you work hard.
Yeah.
And you had to have that balance. And then my best advice that I had ever gotten from, not just best, I've gotten lots of good advice from Kim over the years. Like she's still to this day my mentor. And I think that was an important piece, as well as manufacture time for what matters. Find a mentor, but be a mentor, right? So if someone's giving to you, give back.
Kim is really just an exemplar of someone who lifts as she climbs.
Yes. And everybody had to do that. That was the other key thing. There was no room for politics. So you lift your team with you because there is no I in team. And it doesn't matter what great things you've done. Now, these are the founders, they created Java. So it's really hard to kind of get past that, right, when you're working for them. But they made sure that, as leaders in the company, you had to lift up your team, that it was not just one voice. You had to be the voice for some people that were maybe introverted that didn't necessarily have their own voice, but made sure that all the, ideas were thought through, that were funded, not necessarily funded, but founded under, great context. And that people really kind of looked at what is the art of possible and how do we solve the customer's problems and not create more problems of our own. And I think that was critical to their success.
So from those, very nerdy, I will carry the image of Marimba Halloween in my heart for the rest of my life. True startup days, you've launched on a career in innovation with some of the biggest enterprises on the planet. When you look back on your work in corporate innovation in particular, what are you proudest of?
I would have to say really lifting those up around me is the key. So if I think about one given technology or piece or component, I don't think that book is written yet, in the sense that a lot of what I've been working towards is the foundation of digital transformation. So seeing when that finally succeeds, then I'll be proud. But I don't see, 30% to me is not success. So it's not something that you can have ego or pride over. But I think from looking at corporate innovation, when I realize that I've helped solve a problem that helps people have more time for what matters, right? So whether it's with their families, doing something that they enjoy, reading a book, poetry, for example, right? From that perspective, then I take better pride in that. So the biggest thing that I think I've learned from the experience working with the people that have mentored me is to be that lead by example. I've always led by example, even if sometimes they were difficult decisions, I've walked away when necessary because it wasn't the right thing from an integrity perspective when you look at yourself in the mirror. So I guess I'm proudest about that. Doesn't always make me the most popular player in the room, but at the end of the day, I know that I've made a difference, and that's key. So you can't point to one thing, and I think that's what drives me too. So I don't rest on my laurels. I have done a lot, and I've had a lot of success, and I'm very grateful for that to the people that have lifted me up and the people that I've worked with on that. But I do know that, it's one of those, I wouldn't be able to do that without that strong group of people, lifting each other up together, because there is no I in team. Mm-hmm. So there's no one thing I can say that is all me. Realistically, I can point to the customers, I can point to the developers, I can point to the leaders that help make it happen. So I guess the biggest thing would be being a leader that leads by example and really tries to make a difference.
Are there any specific customers that really stood out? Any corporates that did a really good job with this?
Oh, there are some amazing ones. And some of them I write about in my books. So when I look at like the NFL, Aaron Amendolia, and he, that was post-Marimba days, but what they've done around digital transformation and really kind of revamping, not only do they use the technology, but how do they function as a corporation and pull some of these pieces together is absolutely phenomenal, right? So moving, people from being chief firefighters to strategists, so really kind of being on the cutting edge. And they've done some phenomenal things in that area. Other customers that I've worked with over the years, when I think about, some of the larger ones, large telecommunications, like Verizon that was a Marimba customer, they've always done a phenomenal job and really keeping focus on what matters, right? So they would tell you if you made a mistake, what the impact was to their customers. So it made you think twice. There were some hospitals that I worked with that I absolutely loved. Probably one of the hardest ones was imagine going into a Catholic nun and then basically telling you, so how is this going to help me buy more blood? And really helping them help you put it into perspective. So and that's, kind of in the other big epiphany for me as a leader, and probably you'll appreciate this. So on a personal level, my husband did have open heart surgery, and it happened to be at some of my clients. And so imagine going and watching them do the echo, and you're looking at the laptop that they're doing on the portable machine, and you're realizing you see that your little icon on there, and you're like, wow, I never thought that the lives that it could help save or the difference that it could help make would actually have such a profound personal impact, and really help me take a different approach too, and how I looked at things, and making sure that when we deployed, code, and we always did before, Kim was always very adamant on before, but even upping the game to making sure for certain environments that we understood what the impact was going to be. And that whole idea around fail fast, find fast, fix fast was a critical aspect, not just in DevOps, but realistically as part of BSM, because you needed to be able to address those issues so that patients, especially in healthcare, I think would be the biggest one, aren't impacted. Like banks, it's money and different things like that. There's a huge impact, but the biggest impact on people's lives could be life or death, frankly.
That is a really sobering story. And it's humbling to think that, these pieces of technology that we work on actually have the power to dictate people's lives and deaths.
For good and or bad.
Yes.
And I've seen the opposite. So some stuff that I've worked on in the virtualization realm, a hospital that will not be named, they had implemented nascent technology into their ED department. So when we first did VDI, they had the doctor looking for the IP address on the system. What they really needed was the IP address on the server. So it was a poor implementation. And it was one of those, it was a question that I was asked at VMworld and by this particular person. And I told them, well, tell them that you made a mistake, because one, you shouldn't have implemented nascent technology into production for life or death. And two, didn't do a good enough job, obviously, training your support staff to understand what to look for so that the doctor can focus on the patient and not on the technology in hand. And I think as technologists, we have to realize that profound impact that we can have, either for the good or the bad, to our customers and what they're doing.
I guess one of the encouraging things we've seen over the course of our career is this idea of human factors, human-computer interaction, moving from what was honestly a periphery, a marginal interest in the 90s to really front and center of how design thinking happens now.
Yeah. And for me, as you know, that is a big deal because that's my background. So my master's is in, instructional technology, human performance technology. That's what I focused on. And I started out as a usability engineer when it wasn't as a popular career path to take. And everyone thought I was a little crazy for going in that direction, right? But now it all made sense.
Yeah. We've been working on augmented intelligence for the last 50 years. We just didn't realize it until now.
Yes, exactly. We're finally getting to the right approach.
Jeanne, if you had one do-over, what would you do differently?
Looking at the fact that Alchemist is to help people that are doing startups is not to provide too much information during the due diligence and the pitch phase. I have had developers taken from, VCs with entrepreneurs in residence that decided that the idea was too good for them not to just keep for themselves. I have had many cases, in fact, one even just recently where they keep coming back to see if I'll join them after they're trying to implement my idea or my my vision and technology to see if like I'll shift back because they could get funding again by giving away a bigger piece of the pie. So I think the key there is for entrepreneurs is they may or may not know about the American Invents Act. And I didn't know when I was going into some of this stuff. So they may not know that your NDAs don't really matter, frankly. You think that they do. If you're going for funding, these VCs know that if you don't have the 500,000 it's going to take to do the seed, or the 3 million that it's going to take to actually build the company itself, then chances are you don't have, it's a minimum of $500,000 to open up an IP infringement lawsuit. Ask me how I know that one. And it could cost millions. And then more importantly, a lot of time that goes into that. So you have to be very careful into what you disclose. And even though they need to have some of that information because they're investing, make sure that you really know the person on the other side of the table, because they'll tell you it's a bad idea today. And then next thing you know that they're having a startup funded for it tomorrow. And they've gotten their own group of entrepreneurs and residents to pick it up so they can own a bigger piece of the pie.
So lots of treacherous waters around the startup economy. What are some of the things that make internal innovation, corporate innovation, so difficult?
The key for internal innovation is it actually goes back to the human factors. So humans by nature are resistant to change. And the biggest mistake that most, whether it's consultants or startups or even larger vendors that go in, is instead of making sure that everyone has their fingerprints on the pie and you're lifting the team up, right? The organization, whether you're doing DevSecOps or something of that nature, they want to be the one to get all the credit. So they continue to work in their silos. And so the idea of incubation isn't necessarily including all the different people that really need to have the insider input, because they know when you push, where does it poke out? But they want to be the genius to deploy it. Or they just look at the technology and they don't think about the processes or the people. It's the people that will kill it every time. It's that humans' resistance to change, the not invented here. I've spent 20 years working on this system or process that I implemented. So I've dedicated my blood, sweat, and tears to that. So I don't want to change it because that's critical to me, even if it's better for the organization, because they feel like that is their job security.
What's really interesting about both those answers, the internal and the external innovation answers, is that they come down to the same thing. Trust doesn't scale. It's really difficult to form a trusting working relationship beyond the 3 to 5 people in a startup team. As organizations get bigger, it's harder and harder to form those bonds that make work feasible.
It can be, but not always.
Right.
And I think that's the key is and I write about this in some of my last books, it's important that you find those change agents.
Yeah.
Because they exist in every pocket, every group. There's always those that aspire for a little bit more. And don't be ageist, meaning that the change agents I've seen have varied anywhere from interns all the way to people that have already retired and they're consulting back to the company that really understand on both ends of the gamut what the impact could be. And you balance them and getting them on board. That positivity is contagious.
Yes.
And so when I think of BSM and I think of VDI or universal clients, what we've done a lot with cloud native and some of these different areas that I was fortunate enough to be part of defining, the reason why it took off is if you look at the one thing that Diane Green, Kim, others that I've seen in this area, Jeanne Kim, what they all have in common is they're all very positive, uplifting people.
Yes. Yeah, that's true.
Right. It's don't tell me why I can't. Tell me what you can or what you're going to do so you figure out what you can. Right. And that was so if you think of these things that have really been successful, if you're looking at it from a entrepreneur perspective, is shed all that negativity. And sometimes we're going to have it because we'll have bad days, but you shed it and you think about how can I just focus on what I can do and make it happen.
That's such an insightful point. And your point about ageism is really interesting and well made. During my time at Autodesk, it occurs to me there were 2 universally loved change agents. One, this was her first job out of college. Shout out to Molly Sun, a project manager who just got stuff done, really phenomenal at moving through different silos of the organization and persuading people. Another woman of whom I could say all of the same things, had spent most of her career at giant companies like GE, had come to Autodesk just before retirement and was the person on whom everyone could depend to execute. So shout out to Anne Friend. But yeah, at those 2 ends of the spectrum, they were just able to build trust by very, very consistently delivering on their promises.
Exactly. Over deliver, undercommit.
Yes.
Too many people overcommit, underdeliver. So make sure you scope the work and understand that you need to leave at least 30% pad for unknowns in the agile world that we live in.
You're preempting my next question, which is how would you distill your experience into lessons for our listeners?
Well, the key is when you're thinking about corporate innovation and how you can expand within your own organization is really kind of thinking about who are those change champions and creating that table. So if you don't have a seat at the table, you create the table and you invite them to it. Because the one thing that I found more than anything else, people don't want to not be invited to the party. They want to be able to have input and feedback. Right. And make sure that the second thing is actively listen. So identify the low hanging fruit of change from a crawl, walk, run approach. And when you say crawl, it's not just crawling with the technology, but what elements can I implement? Like even if I'm looking at the CI/CD pipeline, focus on what version of the pipeline are you doing, your Java or your .NET? And then understanding based on that version of the pipeline, who are your customers, internal customers, external customers, but also support, operations, different teams. Because if you look at the center, if we look at the pipeline itself, it supports both, right? And then coming up with that communication pathway and plan, not just from a technology scope and implementation, but identifying with those users what those requirements are upfront. And don't do these large, what I call Pepto-Bismol walls, right? I do believe in the scrum of scrums, but now where everyone, literally I've seen where they had 150 people come in the room and they're doing all these Post-it notes all over the walls. And then they're like, okay, take pictures. Well, everyone's so busy filling out their Post-it notes, nobody's actually trying to understand what that pain is. And so if you don't identify the pain chain, which is important, then you can't fix it. And people have lots of ideas. We all have lots of great ideas, but just because you can, it's kind of like Jeanne always likes to say, you can juggle with chainsaws, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you should, right? So we need to think about, does it make sense? So when you look at that innovation, you look at what makes sense for the company. That's a critical success factor, because if you're not adding to the benefit of the bottom line, then it goes back to juggling with chainsaws. Then you shouldn't do it. And so realistically, and then realize that companies are like children, and there are lots of great frameworks out there, right? So for those of us who've had kids, and I've got twins, and they are as different as night and day. They don't even look alike. But what would work for one is not necessarily going to work for the other. So make sure that when you think of the framework, kind of like ITIL and all the other pieces, they're guidelines. Adapt it for what's needed for your company. And it's okay to change the naming conventions if you need to. For example, like if you already have a team called SRE, it's okay to call the site reliability engineering team something else, right? In order to make it easier for the company to facilitate and embrace the change and less friction, right? And that's because there's always going to be the people side is the hardest side of the equation to fix and address. The technology side, you'll have lots of solutions on the technology piece, but always remember that the vendors may or may not always have the answer, because very few have actually walked a mile in your moccasins. So a lot of the greatest innovation has come from, and I've seen, even if I look at some of the early seem to be blueprints, actually came from us integrating things together for our customers. And then us saying, oh, wait, that's a great idea. Like I had 6 different customers in 6 different industries trying to do the same thing or asking for the same thing for socks. So once you get that, you're like, what we need is we need that centralized data store. Instead of integrating everything together, we need to understand those components. So really make sure that if you are working with a vendor, they are actively listening.
This is a big part of why I've become such a proponent of customer discovery, because there's nothing quite as transformative as having those conversations with people who have business needs, who are in some kind of process pain, to clarify everything that happens internally. When you can push an innovation team out of the building and get them to talk to somebody who's using their product, suddenly all of the arguments about frameworks, all of the arguments about naming conventions just become moot, because the real problem is that the customer's hair is on fire and we have a fire extinguisher, and maybe these two situations could somehow come together in some positive way. It's so clarifying.
Yeah. And I agree. I always do what I call field trips. So from the beginning, this is a human performance technology thing, not something that I would say that is a me thing, but something I was taught to do when I was in school. And you basically take your developer and you take your test engineer, go on on site and you observe like coyotes in the wild, right?
Yes.
So understanding what it is exactly they're doing and why, and it's eye-opening. And even within corporate IT and within companies, I've taken that same approach to implementing digital transformation, where I've had, the role of product management, and I've had the developers, and I've had the test engineers actually sit with the business users. So not the people signing the checks, not the VPs or the leaders, but the people actually doing the work and seeing how it was working for them and what wasn't and was. And it really makes a difference, because if they feel like, and this is the key, if they feel like they have input or a voice and you're willing to listen, they become your biggest champions.
They do. And that's how VMware and Splunk got their engine moving, was they gave people the next 5 years of their career.
Yeah.
What happens to those field trips? What happens to customer discovery in the age of the pandemic? How is that going to change?
Well, I think the biggest change that it will have is you're not going to be physically going there on site, because there's going to be more restrictions to go in there on site. Like we've seen that in general, and not just like the pandemic is part of it, but even with more regulatory oversight and social engineering, and not just the actual physical viruses, but all the virtual viruses, right? Have people a little on edge. If we think about how many viruses are written now, I think the last count I heard was over 1 million a day, type of thing. So it's not so realistically, but you can through Zoom, through WebEx, observe. So I've been even just this week doing the day in the life trips and really kind of going through and watching the developers, in this case, CI/CD pipeline, work with a lot of dev, watching them go through the line of work and identifying what are some of the gaps, not just within the technology, but the people process pieces that we need to think about showing up so that we can innovate and then we can scale innovation. Because most innovation fails not in the early days. The minute you go to scale, that hockey stick up, and if you haven't fixed those gaps before you scale, then it explodes at a higher level, right? And DevOps is purely indicative of that.
Yeah, humans don't scale either. And with everything that you manage to get done in a day, I'm constantly in awe. How do you avoid burnout?
You reach for joy and you manufacture time for what matters. So Kim was the one that taught me that, making sure that you, during times in the day, whether it's, you schedule an hour here or there, check out, go for a walk, make sure that, and especially with family, it's always a struggle, right? The key is that with my children, I've always made sure that you never miss a game. You don't miss recitals. You may not make every practice. You read stories every night. So that's the component. And you take time for yourself. As leaders, we don't always practice good non-burnout skills. Like there's some things I could be doing better myself. When I look at the biggest hurdle for me, frankly, with this whole COVID thing was when the gyms closed. Like, well, I went from, working out 5 days a week, 5 miles a day to nothing.
Yep.
So what do you do? Okay, well, other hobbies, I like to cook. Unfortunately, if you're not working out, not a good idea, right? But looking at that balance piece. So sometimes there are times when you don't get the balance, but you just have to, you figure it out. And that's the key, because eventually, and I think this is important for all of us to realize, is we're all human and we will make mistakes. And my kids range in age from 6 to 26. And so the 26-year-old and I have had plenty of conversations about, now he understands now more that he's older, the time that I didn't necessarily have as much time to be there after school. In those days, like a traditional mom would be, right? Now it's changed. Times have changed. But as they get older, they get that. And I think, fortunately, with this upcoming generation, it's going to be easier because they've had working mothers. They understand the struggle, and they try to be more, from both sides, a little bit more flexible with that. So I think it's good. The change is good.
One of the things I find most rewarding about parenting is this eventual consistency. You invest so much in the children when they're infants and when they're small. And then as teenagers, they come back to you and they're extraordinary. They're brilliant and they're interesting and they're wonderful to talk to. And they bring you music and books you would never have encountered otherwise. It's just a delight. Best return on investment ever.
Yeah. And the other thing that I get a lot of joy from is mentoring. So I make a point to, I worked with Arizona State University, so ASU, and then with different schools, but I typically mentor 2 in the US and 2 abroad. So 1 in Europe and 1 in South America, so that I get more of a global perspective And I'm looking at possibly like picking up some I have done in India before as well. So maybe shifting. I've had one in Mexico, but they're finished. They're doing well. They're kind of don't need as much of my time anymore. So shifting over to India or to different countries, because it really kind of broadens your horizon, because you can learn as much from the people that you mentor, and not just mentoring people locally, and not just mentoring women, but women and men, because in order to make a difference, you have to be the difference, right? Across the board by example and lead by example, but really try to reach out to young people that are just up and coming and really kind of learning the industry and the process and stuff like that, because they will look at it from a different lens and they help give you that injection of positivity, whether you realize that you need it or not, right? Or sometimes where you might feel like you've been beaten down, but by listening to these, young people talk and be so excited about the future and what it holds and ask all these brilliant questions and then help you look at it in a different way, right? And so one of my favorite things to do, if you ever have an opportunity to do this, is volunteer at the universities to be part of their engineering pitch day.
Yes, yeah.
For their senior projects. Love that. So I've done that with ASU and different ones where the developers will come in and they'll pitch their capstone project and you'll give them feedback. And then I usually pick 2 out of that. But you learn so much from these bright minds, and the excitement. And then also you're giving back to the industry, whether we admit it or not, gave us so much that we have if we think of it from the longer term.
I'm laughing because my first encounter, the first time I judged a pitch day was for Alchemist back in 2013. And I essentially spent the next 6 years trying to figure out a way that I could get Ravi, the founder, to hire me here to Alchemist. It's the most fun thing in the world. And mentoring is such a regenerative activity. It's incredibly rewarding.
Well, tell Ravi I said he's lucky to have you.
Thank you. Jeanne, what is the best way for our listeners to connect or follow your work?
Absolutely. So ispeakcloud.com. And then I'm also on Bright Talk. So I do webcasts and the key thing with my webcasts is they're completely altruistic. So it's really looking at, I usually include an industry expert and then somebody who's actually implementing the technology in production. So those with the sign the checks and the ones with their fingers on the keyboards. So you get that balanced perspective. So either way would be the best way of getting a hold of me, or on Twitter. So Jeanne Morain, fairly easy. And also on Instagram.
What does the future look like for you personally?
For me personally, it's one of those, I am still very much looking at this particular area that has not been solved yet. So I am determined to fulfill my life's work, frankly, when I think about digital transformation, a lot of these pieces. So much of my life has gone into seeing this bigger picture solved. So identifying more of the gaps, and then also, of course, new technology, because that's tends to be, and not just technology, but people process side on that. So working on many different projects that I won't necessarily get into all the details yet, based on my earlier advice, not to divulge too much, right, from that perspective. But so personally, I've got a couple more decades to go before I'm done per se, and then definitely looking at mentoring more people and lifting up and really kind of giving back, because I think there's just so much room for growth in that area for the industry as a whole.
If you could wave a magic wand and have our industry pan out exactly the way you want it to, what would that look like?
Okay, that is a broader conversation. Really looking at when we talk about cloud native, and if you think about it, I've been writing about cloud bursting for a decade. So Visible Ops, 2010 is when we wrote that book. So really looking at that bigger picture, what I would love to see is not just 30% succeeding, but every company, succeeding. And when we think of the industry as a whole, I'd like to see a lot of these bigger players that they'll take a good idea, but they think that because for whatever reason the hubris is there, that they're not listening to their customers. So doing more of that select program piece of really hand-holding through the implementation, helping their customers, not by having them hire these high price tagged consultants, but really understand while they're rolling out this technology in its infancy, that they need that feedback. And then they evolve with the needs of the customers. And I still think that gap right now is so significant, to the point where my dream is pretty predictive analytics, I think, is going to be the next big thing in this area. And realistically, being able to help senior leadership understand that when I poke, where does it push out, so that they can have better visibility into their organizational structure. But it's not there yet. But the nirvana would be having that, clean CI/CD pipeline, everything automated for Java.net, and the gray areas like mainframe and stuff like that come up. But then also having the that one picture that I know I've shown you in my book that really understands so that you can manage from the infrastructure down, the apps to the users, and that the business can focus on the business of the company and not the business of IT.
Whenever we talk about this, I think about those movie images of mission control in Houston from
Yes.
films like Apollo 13 and The Right Stuff. Just having Ed Harris there, and he has all of the information at his fingertips. And sure, your spaceship is blown up a little bit, but you're going to be okay.
Yeah, exactly. And that was, if you think about when we talked about BSM, when you're at 451 Group back in the day,
Yes. Yep.
it was that single pane of glass. We
Yep.
still haven't gotten there yet.
We haven't.
And I'll ask you a question. Where's the business in business service management?
That's a really good question. It's like asking where's the business in open source, because it's an enabler. It's something that other people build their businesses on. People say open source was a disappointment. Red Hat was the only really big outcome from there. But stick a fork into Amazon, Netflix, Google, Facebook, they're all built on enormous mountains of open source software. I think BSM is the same. I think maybe there will be a big vendor outcome, but it won't be the most interesting part. The interesting part will be hospitals and banks and airlines, if we still have airlines, big ag tech companies, being able to do scenario planning, being able to see a little bit into the future and understand the implications of the decisions that they make.
So that's where digital service management is critical, because most people don't know that 2/3 of the vision for BSM was cut.
Right.
The business templates, fast flow data components, everything that you need to get those outcomes. And so what I'm excited is I think that the industry is finally waking up and realizing the business needs to be front and center. So digital service management truly will be, in my mind, the success of BSM, because in looking at BSM realistically, because they cut those pieces, it's more like ITSM, right? And a lot of the value that we wanted to provide, it wasn't there because of the cuts.
Yeah, that's right. IT is not one division off to one side of the company anymore. You don't manage IT services. Everything is digital now. The entire business is digital. It's all being delivered online. And you have to manage all of those services. And there isn't any business that isn't a digital service in some way.
Well, and that's why the ones that have succeeded have figured that out. So like when I point to NFL or Gavilan Group, they've literally re-architected their business. So people that used to report into IT are now part of the business. People that were part of the business are now part of IT. So if I look at like the Gavilan Group, Gary Ackermite, amazing guy, really amazing, at the time. So when, what they did is they took the engineering architecture team and put it with the business so they could be closer to the customers developing the apps. Right. And then he took over things like supply chain and logistics that are very operationally focused. So the ones that are truly succeeding at digital transformation, they're not looking at the business of IT.
Right.
And I think that's some of the mistakes that the industry is making, is they're trying to say, oh, it's IT for IT, it's a business of IT. I'm not against IT for IT for any reason for a framework, but how do you expand it beyond? Because it's not just the business of IT, it's how is IT part of the business, because every company is a software company.
Is there anything else I should have asked you?
Well, when I think about other things that you should have asked me, and this is more of looking at from a corporate innovation and things that I just started talking about in recent years, is my background. Where did I come from? So a lot of people would be surprised to discover that I was a foster kid. That's why I've been a foster mom from that perspective, and that you shouldn't discount or discredit someone from where they come from, because innovation and change can come from anywhere. And the biggest leaders and heroes, we look at some of the things with the teachers and stuff like that, but I almost did not go to college. So imagine I went and got my master's, but it was because I had teachers that believed in me when all else seemed felt a little bit abysmal, and really helped inject that looking for the brighter outcomes or positivity. And so I think it's important, and that's part of that being a mentor, is lifting all of those up around you, because you never know who's going to make the difference.
I couldn't agree more. It was one of my frustrations with institutional venture, is that everyone was looking for the next Steve from Stanford. The most impressive entrepreneurs that came into my office when I was in institutional VC, one was a woman who'd gone to Harvey Mudd. The other is Charity Majors, who's literally changing the industry. She's got half a music degree from the University of Idaho. That kind of pattern matching that's so prevalent in our industry is actively destructive. It makes people say, well, she doesn't look like a CEO to me.
Well, and I've seen people that I've worked with that, and we've had these conversations ad nauseum, unfortunately. They were told they weren't technical enough, but they had a master's from Stanford in computer information science.
Yep.
How much more technical, and they would have to remind them, like, I actually have my master's in engineering and yours is in psychology. So it's not judging a book by their cover, and not just for women, for men too, right? So people are looking for a certain thing, but sometimes what you're looking for isn't actually what you need, and really kind of going beyond the exterior and really understanding that the balance that's there. And that is the one thing that I am also very grateful to Kim for, because she has been phenomenal in lifting everybody up. And the same thing with Diane. If you think of like Karthik Rao, some of the individuals at Marimba I worked with, they came over from India with $800 in their pocket and a dream.
Very common story. Yes. Yeah.
And it's really embracing the change agents that are really willing to put in the time and make a difference. And there are so many out there that come from all walks of life, and really kind of embracing everyone to lift them up. Because I think the more we can get that positivity, that's how you innovate. And that's how you make the difference, and you change, and you don't give up, because that's the other big one. So when people ask me like, oh, you've got so much energy. Well, I learned the environment I grew up in, you had to be persistent. If you wanted to succeed, you had to be persistent, and you had to keep working at it. You may not get it this time, you'll get it next time, but just keep trying. And if we send that message to the younger people that are coming up, I think it's going to be important to ignite that next generation of innovation and that next generation of insight that's going to even propel us farther than we ever thought we could go.
Jeanne, I can't imagine a better note to end on. Thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been such a joy to spend this time reconnecting.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rachel. It's been a pleasure.
This has been Alchemist X Innovators Inside. You can find the transcript of this conversation, plus links to whatever books, articles, TV shows, and apps we talked about on our blog. And stay connected by following us on Instagram and Twitter. If you found the podcast valuable, feel free to share or tell your colleagues. We love hearing from you. Send us your comments, feedback, suggestions for future guests, or just say hi by emailing us at axii@alchemistaccelerator.com.